Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our WIOA Wednesday webinars. It's been a few weeks. Thanks for hanging in there for the next topic. We are presenting today on the eligible training provider and eligible training program policy, as well as all the associated system changes and processes. If you would, please complete the poll that's on your screen now. We'll be taking that down here in a moment. As usual, everybody is muted until I have a point in time during the presentation where we'll open up the lines for audio questions and comments. But by all means, during the presentation, you can present those comments in the chat pod to the left. Chelsea's putting up some additional information in case you've missed the conference call-in number. She'll move that pod out of the way here in a moment. Hopefully everyone got the two documents that are available in the files pod down the lower left. It's both the draft policy that was sent out as well as the PowerPoint presentation that I'll be using today to guide us through. We'll start with the first slide, and it's just an overview, and then I'll pull that up and make that larger for everyone. What I want to make sure we remember is how this process came about. Back in December, we started the process of developing a policy to allow training providers to come in and add new programs, or if they were not a training provider currently, come in and request approval to become an approved WIOA training provider. We had a transitional policy in place before, so we needed to bridge the gap to a full policy, and so we we're preparing to issue a change one to that transitional policy. We received many comments from everyone, and as we kind of sifted through all those, many were just grammatical and reference type comments, but there were quite a few that were programmatic, were structural, system change requests, and so it took us quite a while to go through all those and decide really what we needed to change at this point in time in a transitional phase. That in conjunction with trying to get the Unified State Plan, doing all of the regional planning sessions, as well as the statewide summit, kind of put us behind to the point where we decided we're just going to have to skip issuing a change to the transitional policy and get the policy out, because we know that providers need to have time to get their information in and request in to the local boards and local areas to approve, but more so to allow those boards and areas to have time to go in and approve, make all those approvals. So what you were issued or sent out last week was the current draft, and I'll start with an apology that we are seeing that some of the references still are incorrect. And so we know we have some changes to make in that regard, but for the most part, the structure of this policy is what it's going to be going forward until we can make further changes to both the policy and the system. IWDES is going to be set up as best as it can to allow all of that. We hope to have those changes done, the final ones changes by the end of the week, and even if the policy isn't signed and issued, at that point in time, we're going to start allowing people to come into the system. But please wait until you get notification via an email from either myself, Neely Schlosser, or Lisa Jones, or maybe Patty Schnorr. We have to decide who that needs to go out to from. So please hold off going forward, but know that we are pretty close to where we can have that done, and you can start that process. And we, again, apologize for taking as long as it did, but we've just had, as everyone knows, we've had so much going on trying to get this together that we hope we're at a point now where we can start that process. Sorry, pardon me while I move these pods over. I'm going to increase your presentation for you. Okay, so what we want to cover today is kind of the brief comparison of WIA to WIOA. What are the major changes? Where did we start at from the previous policy? Where are we now, and where do we need to go really to finalize everything? We want to cover the training provider eligibility Registered apprenticeships have their own kind of significance under the new WIOA law. We want to make sure everyone understands just the general eligibility process for both providers and programs, including any exceptions that are being made. And then we'll get down to some of the more contentious issues of performance reporting that is required by WIOA, and also the demand occupation training list. And finally, we'll finish with monitoring and oversight. And we'll take a moment at some point during this to have you ask those questions, and then we'll also finish at the end of the day with more questions. And I'll try to address some of those comments and questions that came in back in December, but also last week we issued a public comment period. It was a very short one because we felt like the local areas, especially, and working with the Illinois Community Commerce Board has, or Community College Board, sorry, has had their input in this, and so we put up a very short public comment period that ended last night. I have not been able to sift through all of those comments, so we will still have to address those, which might prompt some change, but I don't think of any significance. So we'll get into this. So what are the main differences between WIA and WIOA are that some of the terminology has changed. And you'll see that throughout the draft policy that I tried to leave both of those terms in at this point in time so you can get familiar with them. Also because we know some of the changes in IWDS have not been made to accommodate those word changes. I wanted to try and make sure everyone understood what each of these means. So under WIA, we had eligibility of training providers, and we had certification and recertification of training programs. Under WIOA, that's changed to initial and continued eligibility for both providers and programs. So going forward, we won't be certifying or recertifying, even though you might utilize that internally as an easy term to note what you're doing. But in the policy, those will be removed and replaced by eligibility terms. Under WIA, while there are performance reporting requirements, they were never provided to USDOL, and because we knew we had systems issues, process issues in gathering that data, we at a state level decided to not even request that you had to make performance data entry in order to become eligible or certified. Under WIOA, we really don't have that option. However, as we talk later in the presentation, we're giving you a little bit of leniency at this point in time until we can get everything in motion. Comparing WIA to WIOA as far as the training list, it was based on WIA participant data only, again, but we really didn't do it that way, even though the law said so. We gave you an out, sort of, under the WIA policy letter. However, again, under WIOA going forward, we're not going to be able to do that. And also, the data will include not only our WIOA customers, but it's going to include all students of a training program. And then finally, the demand occupation list, which everyone is anxiously waiting. We're working with the Illinois WorkNet staff to get that done very quickly, or shortly, I should say. And so the changes, for those of you that weren't familiar with that, in the past, to qualify under the first criteria at a regional level, you had to have the occupation had to have an entry wage that was at least 90% of the average earnings negotiated by the local areas. Now, what we did, because we do a demand occupation list by economic development region, or EDR, we gathered all of the negotiated rates for the local areas in EDR, and we averaged those out and then did 90% of that. Also, it had to meet at least 25 average annual job openings a year as estimated or projected over a 10-year period of time by statistics provided by the Employment Security, Office of Employment Security, or Department of Employment Security. And then finally, you know, which I forgot to put on here, we added a second level, which was called the statewide list. So if an occupation appeared on at least 5 of the 10 EDRs, it would actually be put onto all 10, so that allowed some crossover training in other local areas or regions, or the ability for a customer to train somewhere and move to an area that does have demand. And so I'm sorry I didn't put that on that slide, but that was the second criteria. And then the third criteria was any occupation that was in a career cluster was added. Now, that's going to be taken away and replaced by a lower level, minimum level, which will be 75% of that earnings wage, and that will change in the next year or two, because as we go forward under WIOA, the performance measures are changing. We're not using an average hourly wage anymore. We're using mean or median annual wage. So we'll have to figure that in at some point, but starting off, we're going to still use the average annual or average hourly wage as our method to compare. And we've lowered the average annual job openings, or AAJO, to 15 jobs per year rather than the 25. We'll still have the statewide list, so as Illinois WorkNet compiles the EDR specific list, they're going to compare, and if it appears in 5 of the EDRs, we will add it to the remaining ones that maybe didn't meet these first criteria under. We've replaced, and what we're replacing with the career clusters is what we are categorizing an occupation that follows an Illinois pathway. Many of us are familiar with the Illinois pathways. We'll take a look at that website on Illinois WorkNet here later, and I'll show you how that works. But the reason we're doing that is because under the career clusters, we added an awful lot of jobs that had very unlikely potential for openings because they were very low, and the average earnings for some of those was very low, or the entry wage was very low. And so we thought we were training in an awful lot of jobs potentially that didn't meet that first criteria, or even in some cases come close to it. So we're making that change. So those are the main criteria, and that's a state-level demand occupation list, is a state-level decision. The other 3 on this page here are all prompted by the actual WIOA law, not state requirements. So we started with the WIA policy letter back in 2010, 09 PL 57. I wanted to make a point for everyone to note that, because you'll see the new policy. I would guess 75% of the new policy is the exact same as what it was in the old policy, except for those terminology changes that are necessary. And we'll note those as we go through here. It included provider eligibility, and as I mentioned before, they utilized the term certification and recertification, and we outlined the application procedures for training providers to add programs to the list. Had the demand occupation training list, or DOTL is what we acronym that at some points. It gives certain exceptions where programs do not have to come in for certification, recertification. We also included a process for out-of-area and out-of-state training providers and programs to be utilized, and then provided the timelines and the system requirements to ensure everything got into IWDS, or the Illinois Workforce Development System, as best we could. And then those last 4 items, 3 of the 4 will not change under the new policy. Performance measures, as we know, will, and so we'll cover that later. We went to the transition policy, which at that point in time, once the WIOA came into law July of last year, required that we transition all of the current training providers and training programs into a transitional phase, which would have ended December 30th of 2015, but was extended all the way through to June 30th of 2016, and that's the most recent deadline we have that we have no ability to pass by. So that's why we want to get this policy out and get everyone to start working, even if they're transitional phase, getting everyone to start working to get programs and providers in the system and get those approved. We mentioned registered apprenticeships at that time, and the process was simply to contact our office. Neely Schlosser was taking those calls and emails to say that a registered apprenticeship would like to be on the eligible training provider list, and that'll continue going forward as far as getting apprenticeships on the list. And then we halted any requests for new providers, new programs, or any updated information for those transitioned providers and programs because the system wasn't able to handle them at that time. But we're very close to allowing all of this to happen in the next few days, hopefully. And now where are we at? We're ready to issue the final policy. As I say, it's in draft now, but we will take a look at those final comments, any other issues as far as systems changes, and we will be issuing the final policy in the next few days, going through our normal process internally. There's new procedures which are required by WIOA, which we hope we'll have this issued next week. April 1st is what our goal is. Maybe we'll beat that if at all possible. It includes additional changes which need, we're going to have additional changes, like I said, based on comments. We're going to issue this at that point in time, but what we want to do is we know there's some things, some issues that will remain outstanding. So we want to put together a work group and get their input on those additional changes. A couple of examples are that some of the terminology, such as we might say a local area has to do something in the policy, but it might actually be a board function or vice versa. In our minds at this point in time, we don't have a clear distinction, and we almost really don't care which of the entities it is that handles it except for the actual approval. And so that's required by a local board. But we might want to change that language or clarify it so that everyone is on the same page with that. And so we want to get a work group together. We also think that the process might be, burdensome in some points, all of the steps that are needed to get a provider and a program into IWDS. And so we want to utilize that work group to look at other potential processes that might not be quite as cumbersome or burdensome, that might be easier, that might require some system changes, but we're ready to look at that as we go forward. And so there might be a change to this policy in the next few months based on any comments and recommendations this work group will put together. We'll want to make sure we have local area staff and board or staff to the board on that work group. We want our education partners on that to ensure what we're doing at Title 1B with this policy reflects positively on what the education system needs to do as far as gathering data and things of that nature. And that work group will also work towards developing the systems that will be necessary in order to gather all this performance data that we know right now not all providers are prepared to be able to handle and give to us as required. So we'll be reaching out to those entities in the next few days to try and gather a work group, get them going on their objectives as I just stated. We need to make sure we're allowing time for providers to apply for initial and continued eligibility in order to meet that June 30th deadline. There's nothing to say DOL might not come back and give us another extension, but we don't want to wait any longer, so we want to get this out. If they give us an extension, hopefully we're ahead of the game at that point. And then we want to begin the process, as I mentioned, and we'll use the work group somewhat, although some of the education I know ICCB is working towards figuring out the best method for their training schools to gather the data and then report it effectively. So let's start with, we're not going to go through the pages of the policy as much as we're just going to talk about all of the sections. If we need to refer to the pages, we can do that near the end. If there's specific areas that somebody once brought up, we can bring that up. I've got it off to the side, but I don't think we need to do that today. So we want to know who can be an eligible training provider. This didn't change under WIOA from WIA. They changed the wording just a little bit. There are 3 types of entities that become eligible providers. The first 2 didn't change at all. They can be an institution of higher education leading to recognized post-secondary credentials. So they might be approved by IBHE, Illinois Board of Higher Education, or I know some of our programs are approved through the Secretary of State. So those are still in existence. Nothing changes there. We had registered apprenticeships available as eligible providers under WIA. We just didn't promote them, nor did DOL promote them at the level they're going forward. And so we want to make sure to highlight the fact that we want registered apprenticeships on our list as they wish to be. And then the third level or third criteria is whether you're a public or a private training provider. Again, this doesn't change. I've given you some examples of what that might look like. Joint labor management organizations could be a provider of training services, adult education literacy activities under Title II, or industry-recognized training programs, which we had under the old policy and we want to continue. We have a lot of manufacturers, maybe, are an example, where they provide training on their machinery to employees through an employer that either is purchasing or has purchased a piece of machinery. And if that training is recognized and leads to some kind of accreditation or approval, we want to make sure that we can train that, because those will help under a lot of our training options. So again, nothing really changed on who is eligible or who can be eligible. Again, they must request through an application to become one of our eligible training providers, but they're eligible by the fact that they're meeting one of these three criteria. Okay, there are some exceptions as to the types of training and the providers that we don't have to ask them to come in and request addition to the eligible training provider list and receive approval. As I mentioned, registered apprenticeships, they're automatically added to the list. I put after that limited applicability because they have to ask to be added to the list. Just because we know a registered apprenticeship might exist doesn't mean they're going to be added to the list automatically. They need to come in to the local area, local board, or come in straight to us, Office of Employment Training, and say they want to be added. And as long as we can verify a few pieces of information and verify that they're actually a registered apprenticeship, we'll add them. And when we talk registered apprenticeships, here in Illinois, we utilize a federal process for registering apprenticeships. And so we would have to look to USDOL to ensure that the provider coming in and the programs associated with them are actually registered. This policy in the past and going forward does not apply to youth training activities. I know that was one of the comments that we received, and it's because they just use a totally different structure for youth customers than what we do for adults and dislocated workers. So this policy does only apply to the providers of training services that are going to be given to adults and dislocated workers. There are also certain types of training programs that we don't ask that they come in for eligibility determination. On-the-job training, customized training, incumbent worker training, internships, work experience, and transitional employment. So basically, the work-based learning that we see in the WIOA that again are more strongly emphasized, those do not have to come in because those are unique in who's going to provide the training, the focus of the training. In most cases, while there is a customized training type of program, they're all customized in a sense because they're meeting a certain need of an employer or employers, and so we can't ask them to come in and become an eligible provider because of that. All right. Let's address registered apprenticeships on their own. As I mentioned, they're automatically on the board so long as they come in and request to be added to the board. I'm sorry, to the list. I've got several people there. They're going to correct me multiple times, I'm sure. We're seeing some of the questions. I'll stop real quick. We're seeing some of the questions come in. We have individuals reading those. We'll address those as we get a chance. If you can try to keep those questions kind of similar or associated with the topic we're speaking at, I can address it at that time, but if it's off topic, we'll address it later. I see one here, and excuse me if I'm letting some other ones go by. We'll come back and catch those. But LWIA 7 is asking or stating they're confused on youth is different. If youth wants an ITA, don't they choose from a list of eligible providers? There are policies that require that, and so in essence, yes, the program has to be on here, but that's not true for 100% of the time. And I think there's also some local area decisions that need to be made. I apologize for not knowing how the process for youth training works fully, but again, just emphasize that under the old policy, youth was not included, and we're continuing that under the new policy. Now, again, with our work group, that might be something that needs to be discussed further and clarified as we go forward beyond this issuance of the new policy. Okay, so does an RA need to apply through IWDS or through another form of request? Okay, we'll get to that here in a second. Like I say, local boards and local areas should reach out to registered apprenticeships to let them know of the WIOA requirement. We got several comments as to asking why the local area or board needs to do this, and all we're saying is that we're asking to try and get as much notification to registered apprenticeships as possible. We'll probably add something to the Illinois WorkNet site on training on our policy site, maybe another area of Illinois WorkNet to get this message out that they can come in and be added and get them identified or notified of the process to do that. We are allowing that process can start at the local area level or at the state level. If it goes to the local level, then you're just going to have to get us the information, because what we want to do with registered apprenticeships is add them on a statewide list. So if a registered apprenticeship in Chicago has programs in Chicago and Springfield and Carbondale, they only have to come in once and say, I want to be on the list. Once they show that interest and provide the information necessary, both on them as a provider of the apprenticeship and on all of the locations that they're providing those programs through, then they can be added. So again, we don't care which method they use. Some of them might be more comfortable contacting the local area because they work with them. As Vicki's stating, IDS already has a website for registered apprenticeships. So, they might go, want to go to the state and indicate that they have an interest. But back to the statewide list, once you contact us and we get it into IWDS as a registered apprenticeship, that will cover the entire state. They won't have to come in multiple times because they are providing that program in multiple areas. From a performance standpoint, because of a customer is associated with the local area, you'll still be able to get credit for those customers and their outcomes through registered apprenticeships based on the reporting ability that IWDS allows. We do not have an actual list of registered apprenticeships in the state. At IDS, if they have one, we can maybe reach out to them. We've had a lot of difficulty in trying to gather that. DOL, United States Department of Labor, has a listing of all the registered apprenticeships, but it would take many man-hours to, kind of go through their system and pull them out, because there's not a single point of entry to their system to be able to print out a list of all registered apprenticeships. And so that was, we thought maybe we would use that initially to gather a concise list, but we were unable to do that. However, once a registered apprenticeship comes in and says they want to be on a list, you can certainly utilize that, will utilize that to say, hey, they are registered. I went on USDOL and verified it, and so we can check that way. Let's see. There are 7 required pieces of information. It's just, who's the provider, where are all these locations at that they're providing the program, what are the costs of the program, because local areas still have the ability to set cost limits on training programs. And so you'll want to know what each of those registered apprenticeship programs are going to cost so that you can make sure that it fits within your local area limits. Again, I mentioned the statewide basis. Regardless of where they come in or reside, they'll be added to I guess, local area 90 or however we do that as a statewide basis. And then finally, performance will be available through IWDS, as I mentioned, to get credit for your customers that are going through those programs. All right, so what's the eligibility process? It's pretty consistent with what you found in the old policy, 09 PL 57. So I'll only identify some of those, changes, or I will identify the changes, but also some of those more important areas that people have had some concern with. There's an exception for the transitional eligibility and RAs that we've talked about. Going forward, transitional eligible providers and programs will have to come in and request new eligibility before June 30th and receive that by the local board or a committee if they so choose to have one. You need to set up a system for applying, which is consistent with the old policy where the program is listed, is located, is where you're going to apply for if you're a training provider. So if you're located in local area 7, that's where you would apply in the system. The training provider record is not changed. There's a full process for getting a login and password that you have to apply for, and then you'll get that back, and then you can go back into IWDS and start entering all the specific information for you as a provider or all of your training programs. Now, if you're already in the system, you may only have to just update information. You won't have to enter it all brand new. And so we want to make sure that everyone understands that hasn't changed. You also have to assure us that you have met all of the requirements such as ADA compliant, all safety precautions are in place per Occupational Safety and Health Administration. There's a long list of those, 8 or 10 of those that you have to provide assurances. Again, those have not changed. We talked about the demand occupation already. We will talk about it a little bit later again. But you have to ensure that if you're not an exception, you have to be on the demand occupation list in order to come in and request a program be added. And how that works is you have a training program if you're a provider that is training individuals to become whatever the occupation is. You have to have identified at least 3 occupations that your training program might lead to. And if it's on the occupation list, then you can add the program. If it does not appear on the list, if none of those occupations appear on the list, then you're not going to be eligible as a training program. There's a timeline on how this whole process has to work. You enter the data, you request approval for eligibility. There's a certain amount of time that local boards have to address that eligibility request. If they don't, there are certain consequences that may occur. And then once all that's met, the local Workforce Innovation Board, or LWIB, has to provide final approval. That's for initial eligibility. That means you're coming in for the very first time as a provider and or a program. And we'll talk about continued eligibility here in a moment. But the first time in, the board has to approve it. While we've allowed for a committee of 2 or more individuals, that remains under the policy that the board can assign to review these. They can review it. They can, verify all the information, but the board has to provide that final approval in this initial eligibility phase, which used to be known as initial certification. Once approved, you'll be added to the eligible training provider list, or ETPL. We'll use that acronym an awful lot. That's the list of all the programs and providers. It's available on Illinois WorkNet, although Illinois WorkNet has a more concise, more broad listing providers because they're not addressing only eligible providers for our purposes. You'll get an eligibility date. So from the date a program is approved, you have a year of eligibility, and at which time you have to come in for continued eligibility before that year expires. And you can begin enrolling customers once that approval has been provided. If you're an out-of-state training provider, we'll discuss how that occurs for initial eligibility here in a moment. Okay, so somebody's asking about how we address occupations that might be out of state, and like I said, we'll address that here in a moment, Bill. But we've got a process for how you address the, like his example for anyone that doesn't know Bill, he's down in the St. Louis area, and so they might not have an occupation that is on the eligible training provider list for his local area or even a surrounding area, but it might be a demand occupation in the St. Louis area. And so we will cover that here in a moment, Bill. Okay, we got a question. Will providers go to workNet to update training programs or IWS? Everything is handled in IWDS for approval and update of information. The information that IWDS handles is then transferred to Illinois WorkNet. So everything that's being done on Illinois WorkNet is based on what is provided in IWDS. So yes, please do all of your actual work in IWDS. Okay, so we continue. Once your year is about to expire for initial eligibility, the training provider will want to come in for continued eligibility for itself and training programs. And under the new WIOA requirements, because you have eligibility for both providers and programs, they just kind of are handled together. You wouldn't come in as a training provider and request eligibility unless you're requesting for a program be added to the list. You know, there's just no need to ask for your own eligibility until you have a program you want to put on the list. And you would be doing the process kind of simultaneously, where you're asking and providing information for your provider as a provider, as well as those programs or a single program if that's what you're requesting approval for. You're doing it all at the same time, entering the information in IWDS. So that year period of time comes up, you'll want to come in prior to that and allow enough opportunity for the local board to provide approval of continued eligibility. So you might want to come in a month or two in advance and make sure you've given enough time for them to do that so that the year doesn't expire and you have not received your approval. If you are a transitioned provider or program, under that transitional policy we issued back on July 1st of last year, you are going to come in under continued eligibility, so you get to bypass the initial eligibility. The transition phase was your initial eligibility period. And so you'll come in under the continuing eligibility or recertification, if you recall it being called that under WIA. You'll want to make sure that you apply through IWDS, as we mentioned. It may only require that you're updating information, that very little has changed, but you still have to go through the process. Even if no information has changed, you still need to go in there and indicate your interest to be approved for continued eligibility. Again, this one can be done by the LWIB local board, but here's where we allow that committee to start coming in and providing some approval authority. If the local board has given or developed or assigned a designated committee, it has to be at least 2 or more individuals, then they can provide approval for continued eligibility under some circumstances. If a program or provider information changes dramatically, they, as a committee, might choose to say, we want the board to review this and approve it. But if not, if they feel like they're comfortable with the information that's been provided in this phase, they can provide what's called basically a temporary approval. The board still has to provide ultimate approval, but what's nice about utilizing the committee is that you can continue to enroll customers. You don't have to wait for the board approval process. The committee approval allows you to continue enrolling customers. Now, if by chance the board sees that information and for some reason has concerns with it and chooses not to approve it, well then the provider or program would come off the list. Any customers enrolled up to that point in time will remain in their program, but they will not be able to enroll any new customers. As I mentioned, if it's not approved within 30 days, it will also come off there. However, any customers enrolled during that period of time will still be able to complete their training program, with an exception we'll talk about later. In order to purge our system and get old programs and providers out, after a 120-day period of no activity, we take those out of our system. And so if you missed the deadline, or maybe you just had as a training provider, had no need to request continued eligibility at the point in time your initial eligibility expired, but 3-4 months later you choose to come back and say, hey, I do want to be added to the eligible training provider list. If you've waited more than 120 days, you're going to have to start the process over, because you'll be entered onto what's called a capture list. And here's where I think that work group will have some of its activity is looking at this kind of a process. For those of you that have been doing this for years, I think it probably sounds fairly familiar because it hasn't changed since that original WIA policy. But it may be confusing to some. I know we do get some questions at times in the past, or we have received questions in the past about some of these processes. We've tried to clarify them as best possible, but the work group may want to look at this whole process and recommend some changes to make it a little bit less cumbersome, maybe more than anything, make it more understandable utilizing different terms or processes. So that's the continued eligibility phase. You also might be up for continued eligibility if you just have informational changes. That can occur during either the initial eligibility period or continued eligibility period. So say, for an example, you're a transition, we're going to use a transition training provider or program first. You received your transitional eligibility July 1st last year. You're now getting ready to come in and receive, you want continued eligibility, so you've applied for that and you've changed certain information. That's going to be looked at. There's certain information that automatically prompts activity by the local board as far as approval, reapproval. And I say reapproval, that's not really a true term in the policy. It just means if you, whatever phase you're in, whether it's initial eligibility or continued eligibility, you're going to be evaluated again. And at that point, your phase from initial eligibility to continued eligibility will begin. So that might be only 6 months into your initial eligibility period of 1 year because you have some kind of significant information change. Maybe your cost change. There's attachment A outlines all of the information change data that we require you to report. There's a double asterisk set of fields. I think there's about 6 of those that are mandatory fields. If you change one of those as a training provider, you will automatically be reevaluated and for approval by the local board. Again, I mentioned a significant change in your program design or scope. Cost changes will prompt that, and several others. There are other mandatory fields, but they don't prompt automatically the local board to provide new approval unless the board feels so. They're going to look at it, but if they just ignore, or the committee may look at it and say, you know what, this is not significant enough for us to send it to the board for a new approval process. And so those are noted on that attachment A as a solo or a single asterisk item. Again, this hasn't changed from the old policy. It used to be attachment B because we had a different attachment A that we've removed altogether. So this just shifted from attachment B to attachment A with no changes other than the insignificant WIA to WIOA terminology. And then a third type of information that might be changed is what we would consider just other information, which requires no LWIP or committee action. Any information changes that occur or anything that prompts an informational change in the system must be entered within 10 business days of that change so that we can have the local boards look at that as promptly as possible to ensure that the program going forward can continue under that continued eligibility phase. Okay, so we've got an item on IWDS where sometimes you have trouble identifying what changed. I know the process is once changes are made, the local area and local board are notified that changes occurred. We can kind of take that look and see from a system standpoint if we can identify that in bold or different color or some way identify to you what actually changed. So we'll look into that as we continue to work with our IWDS staff to finalize all the changes. Steve's asking where do providers provide their performance data for eligibility. We have added all of the 10 elements. There's a new field that asks for you to enter those. At this point in time, they are non-mandatory entry in the sense that if you don't have them, obviously you can't enter them, but you can continue on through the process. However, if you have the information, if you have a provider that has information on their program, you need to enter that because we want to start collecting that data and start evaluating because at some point the state is going to have to determine minimum levels of performance. Right now we aren't going to do that. WIOA does not necessarily require it, but at some point we will determine a minimum level, and so the more data we can get, the sooner the better off we'll be in evaluating and setting those minimum limits. Neely Schlosser's with us today. She can speak a little bit more to the performance area.
Steve, once you go in and, make a change or save your information for the training provider program, there's a new prompt at the bottom that'll say add performance data, and there's a drop down for a year. And then it's just the page with the 10 questions that you just enter the information in. And then you can save it. So you can go back years, and then you can add the new information. So you'll see it. We've already tested it, and it'll be in production once this is released.
Okay. We'll move on to the next one where we continue our eligibility considerations. And we do have a slide here in a moment. We'll talk a little bit more about performance on its own. But these next couple slides have not changed from the old policy, so I'll just quickly go through them. Obviously, there's a potential that a provider or program needs to be denied or revoked eligibility. Something occurs after they've been determined eligible. Maybe they failed the performance. Once we have a performance minimum, maybe they fail it in a year. You might, as a board, or will want to deny or revoke their eligibility. Maybe there's fraudulent activity. Maybe we find out that they lost their registration with an apprenticeship program, or they are no longer certified or accredited through the Board of Higher Education. So as we review that information, or the local boards and local area staff review that information, they might prompt a revocation of their eligibility. Also, certain violations of the WIOA Act, and we continue to state the WIA Act as well, because there might be things that occurred under WIA that at the point of initial eligibility or certification there, that you might need to revoke them before they come in under WIOA for continued eligibility. So if there's still something under the WIA that is violated, and I don't think there's really anything different between the two laws in the terms of ADA compliance and things of that nature. So I don't know that it matters or is significant whether it's WIOA or WIA. I think they exist under both laws. Or the fourth one, if an entity just ceases to exist, then you're obviously going to revoke their eligibility so that additional customers can't accidentally be entered into that program through IWDS. A revocation or denial will remove them automatically from the ETPL. However, under some circumstances, we will allow the customers to continue their training. If it's a failure of performance, but the customer has already, say, completed 1 out of 2 years, we'll allow them to complete that program rather than force them and penalize the customer to drop that program and start a new program altogether. However, if it's a significant act of fraudulence or intentional inaccuracy information that prompts the need to remove customers, we'll want the local board, local areas to work with those customers to get them into a new training program, update their employment plan to reflect those changes. Again, we want to put as little change on the customer as necessary, but obviously we don't want customers in a program that is not going to be effective. One example of that is recently we had customers that were coming out of a training program and weren't able to get jobs, and to come to find out that provider had lost their accreditation with IBHE, which meant the program was basically useless. We don't want customers continuing in a program like that if we find out ahead of time. So that would be the example of not allowing a customer to complete their program. It's unfortunate because they've done nothing. It's no fault of the customers. But if they're not going to get a positive result at the end of that program, we want to get them as quickly as possible into another program. All right, the last couple things are the appeals process. That still exists. We want the providers, if they've been denied approval or revoked, to first apply to the local area. If that does not satisfy their request, they can apply to us. There is potential that if they don't, agree with our decision at the state level, they can go to the federal level, although I don't know that we've seen anyone go to that level. I think it's been pretty clear when someone's appealed who's at fault, and it's been handled accordingly. If, however, on appeal or review that the information was not maybe as serious to promote a revocation of their eligibility, and we need to put them back on the eligibility training provider list, we have process in there that are consistent with the old policy. Now for the performance, as I mentioned, WIOA is requiring mandatory entry of performance data. There are 10 elements that range from number of exiters of a program. Now, there's two levels of performance. There are all student data, and there are WIOA customer data. We automatically get the WIOA customer data because they're entered in IWDS. So in the policy, we just kind of ignore that because we know we can get that data out of the system. So really all we're requesting is for all student data. There are 10 elements, and I'm going to jump to the bottom here, and then I'll come back to the other. I probably should have put these the other way. I want to talk about the elements first. Like I said, there are programs of study we have to address. We've defined that as a series of classes or courses that lead to a positive outcome, certification, degree, diploma, something that is recognized. So it's not necessarily just one class, but we know that some programs of study are one class or one course. An example would be an over-the-road truck driving. It's one course. While you learn multiple things, it is one course. You don't go through a class on reading maps and a class on driving an 18-wheeler and a class. It's all part of one class. But most programs of study, especially at our community colleges and universities, are multiple classes or courses combined together that lead to that outcome of a diploma or degree or certification. An exiter is someone who is no longer in the program during a given program year. Whether they be a positive exit or a negative exit, they're just no longer part of the program at a given time. They could have dropped out, they could have been expelled, they could have completed. A completer, though, is more precise in that a completer met the terms of their goals of that training program. So they went into a 2-year program to become whatever their degree or diploma was meant to become, an architect. I don't know. I'm trying to think of something that might be on the eligible on the list. But say they wanted to become an architect. They completed that, got their diploma. That's a completer. That means they had a positive outcome. An exiter is everybody that left the program, not just by positive, as I mentioned. I'm going to jump over. Levon's got a comment. Somewhere we've got that under the performance, and I'll find that here in the policy so I can reference you to the page of that. All 10 elements are found on page 5 of the policy draft, and hopefully your pages are the same as mine. You'll find all 10 of those. No, that's not it. Where am I at? Oh, performance is all the way in the back. That's right. We initially, I'm sorry, we had it further up in the policy, and we chose to make it its own section. So it's actually section J of the policy. You will see that we have a little bit of a note that I'm going to mention here in a minute. Then you move into the 10 elements that are being requested. They're all pretty straightforward, except for these definitions we want people to understand. We also, we have the definition of exiters, completers, program of study. You'll have to provide wage rates for quarter 2 and quarter 4, things that we're pretty familiar with at the local level. And working with ICCB especially, but we'll want to use the work group to maybe bring in some private training providers. We need to figure out the best method and best avenue to gather this data. ICCB is going to try to work up some kind of a system that all of their 47 community colleges can utilize to gather data. Then maybe it can be uploaded without having to have the provider itself upload that individually. But that's what we want to use the work group for, is to come up with the best method to ensure the providers understand the data that's needed, understand what programs of study are, who all students are, and one note on all students, and where we really need to get some clarification and hope that further guidance from USDOL will provide this. We have a program of study. There might be 20 customers in it. We don't know how many of those are truly in a program of study. They might be in a course, say Accounting 101. Do we know they're in a program of study, or they're just taking 101 because they want to learn something about their taxes? I don't know. So we need to figure out the system to identify the students that we're going to gather when we report data. That's one of the biggest issues right now is how we're going to collect that data. You walk into community college, I don't think they ask immediately, what program of study you're here for. You might only give them the 5 classes you're taking in a semester and never identify that you're there to become an accountant or what have you. So we have to make some changes. ICCB and all training providers are going to have to make some changes to, determine who all students are as far as enrollments in a program of study. Data will be entered, as Neely explained, in IWDS, and the data that's required will be for all programs seeking initial or continued eligibility for the current program year and 3 previous program years if the program existed. Now, again, we're going to have some moments where the data is not available, the program did exist. We're going to ask the best to their ability as a provider to give us that information. But if they weren't collecting it in the past 3 years and don't have it, we're not going to initially penalize them for that. Now let's move to the top of this screen here. What I mean by that, state of Illinois is kind of bypassing the the regulatory requirement that this data be provided under WIOA, and we're providing some leniency to allow the procedural and system updates that are going to be necessary. Currently, what we're going to say is if you have the data, provide it. If you don't have the data, you should be preparing that no later than July 1st of 2018, so just over 2 years, you will have a system in place to gather this data appropriately and provide it to us. Now, I need to make sure everyone understands we're awaiting that guidance from DOL, and if they come back and say, no way, we want it now, we're going to have to deal with it. We hope they provide us some leeway there, because we might lose an awful lot of providers or programs if they say you have to collect the data in order to provide the approval. So just hopefully everyone is clear on that for now. Illinois is choosing and will take the hit if DOL says something otherwise on your providers at this point in time and programs if that information isn't provided. But everyone should be working towards a goal of no later than July 1st, 2018 to get those systems and the ability to provide the data in place. Okay. Final section of the policy deals with monitoring and oversight. WIOA, as WIA did, let's go ahead and stop here. We've got a couple questions coming in on performance, so let's go ahead and answer those. Who is supposed to provide the data? All of the data, all of the information for providers and programs is a responsibility of the provider to provide through IWDS. Now, if you're a local area that does not mind and is okay with assisting them in doing that, we won't, not let the local area staff enter that data, but it all comes from the provider, and they're the responsible party to this. If they don't provide it, they're not going to get eligibility approval at the, by the local boards. The local boards will review that information as part of the approval process and should be ensuring that it is accurate data. Once we get to a point where performance data is mandatory and we have minimum performance levels, it'll be the board's obligation to ensure that those requirements are being met. Okay, so it's provider provides the information, board approves based on the information meeting the guidance that is either state issued or locally issued. Again, local areas can be more stringent if they so choose, and in the meantime of the state not providing a minimum, the local areas might choose to say we're going to set a minimum because we don't want to have providers and programs out there that are not meeting a certain satisfactory level of completion rates or wage rates. Will the data, wages for second, fourth quarter after exit is not available in providers and IWDS, is it? Neil, you want to answer since you're a data?
If they're not a WIOA customer, it is not. So that'll be up to the provider to get that information. And we know a lot of them may not have access to it, but in order to become a WIOA training provider, they're going to have to figure out how to follow that customer once they leave the program. and how they're going to receive that data in order to be a... I mean, the community colleges and the other larger schools were working with that to figure that out, but if you're a private provider, it seems like they're going to have to figure out if they want to be on our list.
Yeah, that's where the work group, and especially utilizing our education partners to assist us with this, is going to have to develop, the process for getting that information, because, like for community college students, we don't have Social Security numbers to gather wage data like we do for WIOA. We don't have that for all students. We only have it for WIOA, which leads to another question. Will the providers only be entering the non-WIOA customers? No, you will be entering all student data, which will include WIOA. In order to get a report for WIOA, we will be able to extract that from IWDS data and say, here are the performance outcomes for WIOA customers. So we will want all students, including WIOA, reported by those providers. How they gather that data is, again, going to be part of that work group. Small providers, the majority of the information will be fairly easily gathered. They'll know if a customer completed satisfactorily or not, so whether they're an exiter and a completer or just an exiter, the wage rates will be hard for them to gather. We understand that, so we have to figure that out. And again, we're waiting on DOL guidance to let us know how we're supposed to gather that, especially in this environment where minimal touching of Social Security numbers is needed. I don't know how else we're going to get wage data without Social Security numbers involved. So we have to have that determined, and that's why we're given this leniency, because we know the information's not available until further guidance is provided, and we can develop those processes and systems to gather it. And we'll have to provide that information to private providers, especially because they won't have the systems that maybe the community colleges and universities will be able to implement as a whole. And so there's a lot left to be done in that respect, and so we are keeping minimal what we're asking at this point in time, but are asking, again, if you have data as a provider, provide us everything you have so that we can start figuring out what's lacking, what isn't being able to be provided, but also start looking at the outcomes currently and deciding on some goals going forward. Perkins, as adult education, will need to, they have their own performance under WIOA. I can't speak to that. I don't know that we have anyone on the call right now. I know Levon's here, but she's not with the adult education program. But it's not related to what we're doing with this policy, because we're dealing with our Title 1B customers, and only as it relates to the fact they are enrolled in ICCB schools are they being brought into this, because we have to get the data from them as a provider. Adult education, as we mentioned earlier, is one of the exceptions, so long as the adult education class is leading towards entry into some other type of training that leads to certification, diploma, or degree. They don't apply to this policy doesn't apply to them anyway. They're preparatory type classes. Okay, I'm getting my terms confused. Wagner-Pfizer is the adult ed. No?
No. No.
All right, somebody else talk. No, sorry about it. Anyway, right now, Levon, if you want to step in on this, your phone's unmuted. I apologize for getting these confused. If you want to speak to that.
That's all right. Okay, now, the performance measures we're talking about in this policy letter are specific to ETPL, right?
Correct.
They're not the overarching WIOA policy performance measures, the 6.
That is correct.
So Val, I think maybe that's where Val might have been getting a little confused. This doesn't matter whether you're Perkins or you're adult ed with an occupational program like Accelerating Opportunities or ICAPS. That would be one you could put on this list. But this doesn't really apply to a specific program, Val, like Perkins or adult ed. It applies to anyone that wants to be, any provider that wants to be on the list.
Okay.
Am I answering?
Yeah, that's correct. And also, I mean, our overall WIOA performance measures, these consist, I mean, they're included in this as well.
Yes, I'm sorry, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, in terms of just if you're just applying as a training provider, it is, in a sense, I thought, separate from the, quote, WIOA in that sense. I know there's overlap.
Okay, thanks, Lavon. Sorry about that, everyone.
I don't know if I helped or not. You're welcome.
Okay, another question is, if a program is set to pending, and that's just one of the phases of entry of information into IWDS, goes into a pending status awaiting local board activity, approval, or denial. The way the system works and has worked, and I don't anticipate that it's changed at this point in time, is if you're set to pending, you can enroll customers. And that's why, especially during the initial phase, you want the boards to respond as quickly as possible for approval, because you don't want customers being enrolled and then all of a sudden a program be denied eligibility, and you have customers in that already. So it's no change from what it was before. If you had the ability to enroll customers during a pending phase before, you'll have that same ability. That's not been changed in IWDS, but we will look into that. All right, let's go on to the next one. We've got some more questions we can answer here after we get back to that. Monitoring and oversight hasn't changed the requirements. WIA as well as WIOA both required certain levels of monitoring and reviews occur. All new providers have to go through full monitoring. What that means is you'll verify all their information. You'll verify the program is legitimate, that it exists, that the school exists. And that's why monitoring is different than oversight. Monitoring is really a physical check to ensure they're meeting all the requirements of this policy, including ADA accessibility, equal opportunity is in place. Oversight is more of the annual reviews that have to occur, that can be desk reviews. Those are acceptable to ensure that the information is accurate that they are providing, whether it be performance data, changes in the data, or information that the provider or program has entered into IWDS. They continue to have accreditation. And so we want to make sure everyone's clear. Monitoring is the on-site physical checks to ensure everything is legitimate and meeting the requirements of all these other assurances that have been provided. Oversight is more of a review that can be done as a desk review. A desk review might prompt a visit to an establishment, to a training provider and their facility because of the information that might be checked. Every 3 years, monitoring needs to occur. That's to ensure ADA, equal opportunity, physical sites continue to be meeting those requirements. I know we've had several people wonder how that's going to occur. That's very time consuming. We will allow, it is allowed, and we state that you can work with other local areas or entities to ensure this is being done. So if you know that, say, vocational rehabilitation, and I'm putting them on the spot maybe by saying this, but if they go out and do a survey of a facility for ADA compliance, and they have a report that says they are in compliance within the last 3 years, I don't know why we couldn't accept that for compliance on our part. But to allow someone to just go from initial eligibility phase of approval to go 5, 10, 15 years without ever going back out to verify anything with an in-person visit and assume nothing has changed is asking too much also. So we do need to make sure we understand that every 3 years some kind of a physical monitoring needs to occur with these providers to ensure everything's in place. Monitoring is required by other acts. Someone's asking, is this required by the act? It is required that monitoring and oversight occur. It does not necessarily say the frequency or the extent. Illinois has chosen in the past, under the old policy, to go with this type of monitoring and oversight request and requirement, and we are not changing that at this time. There'll be a work group if they want to come up with recommendations and convince otherwise. We just have seen programs, not just training providers, but other service providers that are not viewed not seen for multiple periods of time, months and years, and then all of a sudden when we go out to find them, they don't even exist, and we have no clue how long they never existed. So we just have to do our due diligence to ensure the system continues to be intact and everything is working as approved by the local board when it first came in for initial eligibility and then for continued eligibility thereafter. So we're going to continue to try and answer these. With over 100 providers, it's difficult to monitor. We understand the difficulty. We understand local areas are, of different size. Everybody has an EO officer, equal opportunity officer, that's been assigned to this duty. Our state level EO officers assist as well, and it's just at this point in time, it is a continued requirement that's not being changed. I don't know how I can say that any different, unfortunately, but as we go forward, that can be, a consideration you bring and recommend to the state based on that work group activity and findings of discussions. Okay, is it an administrative or programmatic cost? I don't think John Barr's here. I don't know how to answer that. To me, it sounds like a administrative cost, but I could see where it could be rolled into programmatic as well. So I can't answer. We'll have to answer that. I don't see, I guess I don't see how it could be an administrative. I don't know what all is added programmatically, but I think it's administrative cost and time consideration. If we've done physical monitoring within transitional period, can the 3-year clock start from that date? Yeah, I would think you've done it because initial eligibility is, at this point in time, is consistent with the transitional period. So if you did these monitoring or oversight visits or reviews during the transitional period, that would start your clock. I don't see why we wouldn't be able to accept it that way. So if you did those in the last 9 months of transition phase, then you would start your other, your next 3-year period of time from that point in time. Those reports, all that information can be accepted for that period of time. Who does the monitoring, someone's asking. We do not dictate who does the monitoring. It just is part of the approval process. And so it's a local board goal or responsibility to ensure everything is done before they provide approval. If the local board wants to assign that function to the local area, to staff to the board, pay for somebody else to do it, however they want to do it, we are not dictating that in the policy. It's just something that has to be done and taken into consideration for approval purposes. If it's not done, the board should not be approving those training providers or programs if it's outside the time frame that has been given. At this time, WIOA 7 monitoring is required. It's a state requirement. We're not letting go of that at this point in time. So changing the verbiage, I don't know that changes anything. Monitoring, as I stated, is the physical, in my mind, it's the physical view. If you want to call it something else within your own local policies, it's basically there are 2 types of oversight here. One is physical checks of certain things that require, the visual sight to ensure that they are in compliance. And the reviews or annual monitoring or oversight, whatever you want to call them, is the desk-type reviews that don't require on-site visits in order to be in compliance, just verification of data and information. So monitoring and oversight are just the words we chose to use. If you want to, consider them different for better understanding, you just have to understand what we're getting at as far as physical on-site compared to desk review requirements.
The board's responsibility for monitoring is in the law.
Yeah, as Laura said, the actual monitoring requirement, oversight is required by the WIOA law. And we have gone a little bit above and beyond in the past, and we're continuing that to require the rest of this. All right. I do notice that I forgot one slide on this, and it was somewhere, I don't know where I lost it, but it's about out-of-state requirements, and I just want to make sure everyone's clear on how that works. It's no change as far as the process for how you can enroll customers in out-of-state training programs. what we've said in the past and will continue to say under this policy is that if you would like to enroll a customer in a program that is not being provided within Illinois' boundaries, you need to work with the other state to ensure all of the requirements of our policy have been met. If they have a ETPL list and they've provided approval of eligibility on their list, and you look at their process and it is consistent with ours, then you don't have to go through the whole process. You say, all right, they've done everything we would do, so we're going to accept their eligibility approval process. However, if you look at their process and there are significant changes, especially things that are not being done that we require in Illinois, you're going to have to go through the process that we require in this policy to approve that program for use in Illinois. That goes the same for the monitoring and oversight requirements. If you feel they're doing a good job of doing oversight and monitoring that meets the requirements of Illinois, then you don't have to go do that. You can accept their reports and their approval of the oversight and monitoring activities and not do them yourselves. There's a process outlined. Again, it doesn't change, so I didn't want to go through all the steps on what you do for entry into IWDS. For the most part, IWDS has not changed other than to allow the data for performance, changes of terminology. In some cases, those may not have occurred, so that's why I tried to keep both terminologies in this first version of the policy. As we go forward, we'll probably remove the terms certification and recertification, especially when you get to dates for recertification. There's still a 2-year period of time under WIOA for continued eligibility, or if you want to call it and continue to refer to it as recertification until that point in time the system is able to be changed. If your local area, if it's out of your local area but still within Illinois, same process exists where the training provider comes to the local area where the program resides, applies through that local area. If it's approved, anybody can use it. If it's denied, it has to sit in a pending status or on the capture list for a period of time until another local area can then come in and try to receive provide approval for that program. That's another one where we had several comments about that process. We do feel we understand those concerns, and so the work group should take into consideration that process as well as all the others we've discussed. And there may be a situation where if a local area doesn't provide approval because they have no need for a program, but another local area adjacent to it really needs that program approved, we might be able to change and say you don't have to wait 30 days for that period of time holding pattern like we have now. We may go ahead under certain circumstances allow it to be available immediately to other local areas because there's not a concern with the program itself. However, if it was denied approval, then the local areas aren't going to have the ability to go in a different local area and approve it if it was denied because of cause, such as they had fraudulent information, inaccurate information. If it was just simply denied because the local board has no need for it and didn't want to go through the process of approving it, then the local board from another local area would be able to grasp that again immediately.
Yeah.
It's not in place now. As I mentioned, we have not changed that, but through the work group, that could be a recommendation to us, and we might be able to accept that recommendation and make appropriate changes. Another question, what ADA requirements are required for online programs? The board should work with, whoever, maybe Voc Rehab or whoever verifies ADA compliance. I mean, there are issues, the same as in our Illinois WorkNet centers, for viewing online online information to ensure that it is available to everybody that wants to utilize it. And so the board's responsibility is, again, to determine how they will ensure that each of those training providers, whether they be physically located with computers or held online only, can be in compliance. With regards to a provider who has training programs in different local areas, is the provider still required to apply to the LWIA where their home office exists and not where the training program exists? It's stated the exact same way, Brenda, same way. So It's where the home office of the provider is located, not necessarily the location of the provider or the program. Many cases it's the same location, but we're looking at where the provider is because those local areas may have a better understanding of that provider than a different local area, especially when we talk about new programs that might be, recently developed. Those local areas where the provider is located might already have a history with that provider. So we want to go through the same process we had before. Okay, when will there be a demand occupation training list? Okay, we're working, as I mentioned early on, with the Illinois WorkNet staff to finalize that. They've got all the data necessary. I don't think they should take too long. However, I can't speak for the length of time they will take. Until that point in time, the current demand list will be utilized under the old policy, and what still exists under the new policy is if you feel there's an occupation, and we understand that those lists are about 4 or 5 years old now, maybe even longer than that. Those lists are old information. If you have current information on a program or on an occupation that would indicate it should be on the list and it's not, you have an application process form, which is the attachment B to this policy, that as a local board can utilize in order to request from the state that that occupation be added to the list. We've had that in there since the original policy in 2010. We probably haven't answered to 10 requests in that period of time. So until that period of time, if you have multiple occupations you want to request additions to, please send those in to us. Give us the information necessary for us to review, to take into consideration, to approve. Okay, so that's been out there, that's existed. Please utilize it in the interim of getting the new demand occupation list out. But I don't think it should take more than a couple weeks for Illinois WorkNet. Again, I hate to speak for them, but I think they were working quickly with that to try and get it done soon and get it out there and available. Chelsea, speaking for Illinois WorkNet, when you look at the training programs on Illinois WorkNet, it already includes the data for the current demand occupation list, and going forward, I would imagine they'll apply any changes to that list in Illinois WorkNet. So you can utilize that. You can utilize the attachment to the old policy that we had before. Chelsea's putting a link to that out there. So again, until we get that list in compliance, the old or current demand occupation list is the active one. You should utilize it, but be aware that the new list is probably going to look considerably different than the old list. Okay, so the next thing I want to do, I know we're running towards an hour and a half, and I don't really like going any longer than that. I'm going to pull up a screen share here, or Chelsea's going to pull it up because I can't find it. I want to run you through what we talk as career pathways. In the past, I said we did utilize career clusters as a method for adding programs or occupations to the demand occupation list. And we're replacing that with occupations that might fall into an Illinois pathways. So hopefully everybody, and somebody please speak up on the microphone. Levon, if you're not seeing this, I can't see what you out there are seeing. I've gone to the Illinois Pathways website that's on Illinois WorkNet. You'll see all of the 9 pathways that they have listed here. There's a lot more information down below that you can reference. Many of you local areas should already be familiar with this because Illinois Pathways isn't that new. So what we're saying is if an occupation does not fall into the demand occupation list because it did not meet the requirements of the 75%, this is going forward, the new guidance, didn't meet the 75% wage requirement and the 15% or 15 annual average job openings, and it's not going to fall under the statewide requirement where it met at least 5 EDR, made 5 EDR lists, we're going to allow occupations that fit into an Illinois pathway. So one example of that is if I go to architecture and construction. You click on that, It opens up, it'll show you some information on that particular pathway, give you some resources. You scroll down, you can see some pathways here. Now, on the left, levels 1 and 2, those aren't what we're training in. As far as WIOA customers, those aren't careers we're training in, because you can reach those careers by receiving just, minimal education, or just need a high school education. What we're looking at is the level 3 over to the right, post-secondary education. So if I come under here, and let's choose maintenance operation, I click on programs and courses, and I see a long list develop of particular occupations. That went the wrong place. What I want to look at is view courses. I click programs. I want to review careers in these occupations under maintenance. So it shows you certain occupations. You can scroll down and see all these. We'll use, for example, here, civil engineering techs. If you look at that, these numbers here under 40 are the average annual job openings for the entire state, not a particular economic development region. So my guess is there may be only one, if any, economic development regions where a civil engineering tech, even though it leads to a very good wage, would make the demand occupation list, because it does not have enough opportunities for our graduates and certificate holders, certification holders, to get a job. And so we say you can't train in that occupation. However, you might be looking at a civil engineering job, or maybe civil engineering tech leads to an environmental engineering technician, which might fit into that, although that's a bad example because it only has 19 jobs. Somewhere I had I think what I did when I was looking at this, I go back and I look under design and pre-construction. All right, so I find a job here that says civil engineers. Wow, there's 323 opportunities a year projected by our statistics. So in order to enter this program, maybe a customer chooses to go through a 2-year college to become a civil engineering technician and then move on to a bachelor's degree as a civil engineer. We would allow you to enter the training program for civil engineering technician only if it's part of that pathway. If a customer says, I want to become a civil engineering technician, we aren't going to train in that because it's not on our demand occupation list. But if they say, I want to become a civil engineer, we're okay with that because you're leading to a job that might, and I'm only assuming this is on the list based on the number of, it's going to be on somebody's list. If all these occupations are in the Chicago area, it would be on their list. If it's split fairly evenly, it might be on 5 or 6 of your local or economic development region lists. So that's one of the examples. We can go backwards and just look at another occupation before I take questions and close this out. I can't see, when I'm doing this, folks, I can't see the chat pod, so I don't know if any questions are coming in. So I'll answer those here in a moment. So I'm going all the way back to the pathways. And I'm going to choose this time around stuck here. It's working slow today, sorry. Chelsea, why don't you go ahead and open the lines if anyone has a question on this. I'm only taking questions on this pathway right now because I want to make sure everyone's understanding.
Your microphone has been turned on.
Thank you. Even though an occupation might not fit on the list, and I'm having trouble here with my, here we go, I think it's moving now. So let's go down to manufacturer. And we could have really utilized the past example where even though I went to a second level occupation, it wasn't on the demand occupation list. We're not going to train in that first associate's degree requirement because of the same thing. We want to make sure the outcome at the end of all of the training provided to that customer is leading to an occupation that is in demand. That's what we're looking for, is occupations that are in demand. And so we go to maintenance, and installation, repair under manufacturing. We see something similar to what we saw before. We have mechanical engineering technicians, pretty good wage. Here we have 60 jobs. It might fall under one of your EDR lists, but I don't know that until we develop that list. But again, we could then scroll down further. Trying to find my mechanical engineering again, sorry.
Okay, that's annoying.
All right, if someone's got a question, go ahead while I'm looking for this. Is anyone wanting to ask questions on the line? Okay, so we go to manufacturing, production, process development, and here we see electrical engineers. That would be an occupation that we would train in. And so again, if somebody wants to go through the electrical engineering technician path as an associate degree recipient, in order to move on to the bachelor's degree for an electrical engineer, we would allow that, even though that electrical engineer technician might not meet the requirements. But electrical engineering technician shows up here too, so I didn't necessarily have to go through that other stage. So with that, Chelsea, if you can exit me out of here.
Would we have to case manage them all the way through the attainment of that ultimate goal of the bachelor?
That would be part of the employment plan of that customer, is that their goal is to become an electrical engineer, not a technician. So you would have to, through career planning, identify that throughout, you know, and so it is that career planner's requirement and obligation to guide them through that process, to let them know that we're looking at a 4-year degree, not a 2-year degree, even though a 2-year degree will be received during their training program period. Okay, you know, as you saw, there's 9 different career pathways there on Illinois Pathways. There's no way we could provide a concise list of how any of those pathways would look. So, you know, as a local board and as a local area, you might want to help the board help identify what some of those pathways may be in your area. And that'll be a little bit more evident once you see your actual demand occupation list, because you'll have an idea what falls on that list and what doesn't. And like I say, some of those technician jobs may fall on your list, and so you can train in just a 2-year degree and get them out there as a technician, because the opportunities and the demand is there. So let's answer some of the questions. A couple of them we got on this. Will there be a way on IWDS performance to access WIOA exers whether they have entered a demand occupation? Well, for WIOA exers, we already have that in IWDS. We know that. In fact, that's one of the performance measures that we measure all of our local areas against. There's an incentive available based on training and receiving the occupation that you trained in. That's the goal. We're not, you know, wanting a goal of just train them in anything and hope they get a job. We hope you're putting them in training, occupational training, or classroom training with a particular occupation, or in sometimes maybe a grouping of occupations that training program of study is leading to, and that's what they receive. That's the goal, is train them in the occupation they're going to end up receiving. Karen asked, I haven't had the opportunity to read the draft policy. No, the pathway, we do have to add this. It's listed in there as a means. It's very similar to a bridge program in the sense that we don't ask that the training programs, educational programs that a customer needs in order to prepare themselves to enter a program of study that leads to certification, diploma, or degree. Those bridge programs do not have to be on the eligible training provider list. So in the same kind of respect, this is just a higher level beyond those entry type basic skills type classes. So it works the same way. If you can picture what a bridge program looks at, it's kind of just the next level. are you saying we can exit them after 2 years, after they complete their first career pathway training program, and could continue on? No, you wouldn't exit the customer. You're continuing them on. It's just a series of programs of studies, as opposed to one program of study. So the example of the maintenance technician, you would enroll them in that. They complete their training program. After 2 years, they receive their associates. The entire goal throughout that 2-year period is to then move on to a bachelor's degree and receive a degree that leads them to a maintenance engineer. And so you just continue them on in their program. They continue on in their training. They've exited one program. You can get a positive, I would assume, result of that, no different than you can receive multiple certifications as you're training anybody. You know that. And so you would not exit them from WIOA and from the system based on the fact they completed their first program of study. Okay, we'll take a couple more questions, and then any other questions that that we did not receive, we're not able to answer, both from this chat pod, and we've got a record of it, or from the comments received initially or through the public comment period. We'll put together a Q&A. I've got most of those from the December comments completed already, so I need to add the public comments to it. And so we'll answer these last couple questions, and then we'll ensure everybody gets the Q&A. We will do maybe add to a new attachment, the career pathway explanation, how that works. And so the next question is, will we be holding on to customers for a very long time, which is very costly? That's part of the training program costs. If you wanted to enter a person, a customer, into a 4-year program, it's no different. You're just entering them into 2 2-year programs with the intent to get them the same outcome as if they entered the 4-year program. The reason you might do this is a customer needs to, maybe the program for a mechanical engineer is located out of their area and requires a lot of travel. And so it takes a lot more of their time. But they can handle the initial 2 years, the associate's degree that might be provided at their local community college. So you would say, all right, let's go through this phase in a 2-year period of time. Let them get something that's more local. They can handle child care, whatever other things are handling, they have to handle in life. But then understand those last 2 years are going to be wherever that next training program is. So maybe they then have to travel to, if you're in Springfield, you're going to community college here, Lincoln Land, to get the 2-year associates, but you want your mechanical engineering degree from University of Illinois, you would then have to make arrangements to enroll in the University of Illinois program. And you would know that, you would have to know that that's their plan all along. So as a career planner, you would not, set them up for failure because they can't complete once they have to start going to that travel to the University of Illinois.
And also, Mark was talking, this is about if something isn't on the demand occupation list and it's through a career pathway.
Right.
So,
Right.
not on your demand occupation list, you have programs that are approved with the jobs. This was just an example that he was going through. Not all customers are going to have to be in a 4-year program.
Right. You might have a certificate needed also that leads you then to an associate's that's on the demand occupation list, but the occupation that the certification initially was being trained in was not on your list. So it's a series of programs of study. Again, think of it as a bridge program, but it's a higher level bridge program because all of these segments of the program of study lead to certification, maybe even a diploma or degree. Okay, final question here. It's a comment Levon said. They will need to ensure that at the beginning of the 2-year program, that the 2-year program articulates to the 4-year program. Exactly. You want to know that ahead of time. Your employment plan for the customer, if you're the career planner, has to know that entire sequence. You're working out the full 4-year plan for them, not just 1 or 2 years at a time, and then you'll wing it at the end and figure out what they're going to do. You're working this through the entire period of time. And your employment plan should reflect that. And so we want to make sure that you, as a career planner, if you're the career planner or your staff, understand you're developing an entire plan of action for that customer that takes into consideration everything they need to agree to before you will approve their plan and enroll them in a class. If you work with the trade program, you're familiar with that. They require an employment plan, and you have to go with that, and there are benchmarks that have to be made and met throughout that training process in order to be approved to begin with. It's very similar to that. Okay, one last example might be, as many of you are familiar, on the current list, CNA is not a demand occupation because the wage is very low compared to what we're looking for at the state level as an entry wage. If you want to become an LPN or an RN, but you're going through a CNA program in order to advance to your LPN or RN training, that's acceptable. The CNA may not be on your list. It may be. I think some economic development regions, the wage rate was high enough that it was on the current demand list. But if it's not on yours and you have a plan to become an LPN or an RN, getting your CNA first and then progressing to the LPN or RN is acceptable. That's what we're saying by a career pathway method of using a program that otherwise would not be eligible on the training provider list. Joanne is asking for templates. We can work with templates. We do not have one at this time. If you're looking at a flow process, something like that, again, all those changes, what you see in the draft now is what we are presenting for final approval and issuance to the local areas, local boards, training providers, et cetera, as final policy. Anything that's not minor in nature, such as grammatical changes, we had some references that need to be updated as we move things around in the draft. The references changed and we didn't catch all of them. Or something that's absolutely significantly necessary to change based on comments in order to issue this policy. Anything outside of that will be left up to the work group to develop recommendations and ideas for, and so we will not be making changes of those nature. Again, we'll leave it to the work group, and we'll get that convened as soon as we possibly can, involving all of the partners as necessary. All right, so the next steps, I'll use that as my last. Thanks, Roy, for leading us to the end here. I appreciate everyone's patience in going through this. It's taken a little bit longer than I anticipated. Next steps as far as what you can do, not next steps as far as the policy itself, but you can start reaching out to your providers and letting them know that it's very soon. IWDS will allow them to go in and start updating their information. In fact, I think it could probably take informational changes if you're current, but it's not going to be able to allow the approval process. So, we anticipate this is going to be issued by next week, and so I would prefer you wait till then. But if somebody were to enter information, I don't think it's going to blow the system up. I think it's going to be okay. If you've got a lot of them and somebody wants to get anxious and at least put some informational changes in there, they can do that. They just won't be able to get the approval process because those fields aren't finalized yet. So we will let you know via an email when the system is ready to go, and you can formally go in and make all those additions to new programs and providers and changes to information on the current programs and providers. You want to let your boards know that this is coming so that they can be prepared for potentially an onslaught of a lot of requests for approval. Let the committee, if you have one that's been approved by the board, know that they can be prepared as well to start doing their work that's been allowed by the board. And so, next step is we'll inform you when the system's ready. The policy may come out before, may come out after that point in time. And so I don't think it'll come out before because then we'll put you in a tough binding situation. But I think the system should be done sooner than the policy issued. Once the policy is issued, everything will be in place. We'll get that work group convened to start thinking through all of these issues and developing recommendations. I will ask, and the committee or the work group will be informed that they need to provide the state with reasons for recommendations. Give us good hard data or reasons why they want these changes made so that we can take those to management to consider. If we don't have the reasons and they're not viable reasons, we may not even take them to management. We need to make sure we're utilizing the time necessary, especially since this process hasn't changed significantly in most areas of this policy letter. With that, I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you. If you have questions, as you see here, on the policy itself, comments, things of that nature, send those to me. If you have issues and concerns about getting registered apprenticeships added to the list, or you have concerns about the system itself, Illinois Workforce Development System, IWDS, send those please to Neely. In the future, Neely is actually the contact for this policy directly. At some point in time, we will transfer even the policy questions and issues over to her, but we'll let you know when that might occur. So right now, please send the policy issues to me until further notice. Thank you very much, everyone, for your patience and participation today. Goodbye.